The train whistle screamed a final, mournful note, a sound swallowed by the immense, indifferent silence of the plains. Dust, the color of old bones, settled over Alara's dark wool coat as she stood alone on the splintered planks of the station platform. Her single, scuffed leather suitcase sat beside her, containing everything she was and everything she hoped to be. The horizon was a mercilessly straight line, broken only by the shimmering heat rising from the tracks that stretched back toward a life she had severed like a rotted cord. In her gloved hand, she clutched a letter, the paper softened by countless readings. It promised a new name, a new life, beside a man named Silas Croft. It gave directions to his ranch, a place she was to call home. But the platform was empty. The town, a sparse collection of weary-looking buildings, seemed to hold its breath, offering no welcome. A station master, his face a roadmap of sun-etched wrinkles, emerged to hang a mail sack. He glanced at her, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, in his pale eyes, before disappearing back into the shadows of his office. An hour bled into 2. The sun climbed, bleaching the sky to a pale, unforgiving blue. No one came. The hope that had sustained her across 1,000 miles began to fray at the edges. Pride, the only currency she had left, straightened her spine. She would not wait to be collected like forgotten cargo. She picked up her suitcase, the handle cool against her nervous palm, and walked toward the town's main and only street. Inside the general store, the air smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dust. The proprietor, a man whose suspenders seemed to be all that held him together, confirmed the directions on her letter. Croft's place? About 3 miles north. He ain't been to town in a fortnight. He squinted at her, his gaze lingering on the hopeful neatness of her attire. You kin. Alara's throat was tight. I am expected. The word hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. The man gave a noncommittal grunt and turned back to his ledgers. The walk was a pilgrimage into emptiness. The road was little more than a pair of ruts carved into the hard-packed earth. The landscape was beautiful in its stark brutality, a tapestry of sagebrush and hardy grasses that whispered in the low wind. But it was a beauty that demanded strength, that promised no comfort. With every step, her city-worn shoes gathered a fine layer of dust, a christening into this new world. Her suitcase grew heavier, a physical manifestation of the life she was dragging behind her. Finally, she saw it. A small homestead nestled in a shallow dip, sheltered by a pair of stoic cottonwoods. But as she drew closer, the image of a tidy, welcoming home dissolved. Weeds, bold and tenacious, had conquered what might have been a garden. A fence post leaned at a drunken angle, its wire snarled and broken. The front door of the small timber cabin was slightly ajar, a dark, silent mouth. A wave of desolation washed over her, colder than the wind. He had left. The thought was a sharp, physical blow. He had changed his mind, abandoned the homestead, abandoned her. She stood for a long moment, the silence broken only by the buzzing of a fly and the frantic beating of her own heart. She could turn back. She could walk the 3 miles to town and face the pity of the store owner, the station master. She could use the last of her money to buy a ticket to nowhere, where she could see it through. Pushing open the creaking door, she stepped inside. The air was heavy, stale with the scent of sickness and neglect. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light slicing through a grimy windowpane. The cabin was one room, Spartan and masculine. A cold hearth, a simple table, 2 chairs, and in a corner bed, a figure lay still beneath a tangle of rough blankets. She moved closer, her heart a drum against her ribs. It was a man, his face obscured by a dark, matted beard and flushed with fever. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. He was not a squatter. The worn boots by the bed, the calloused hand resting on the blanket, the very lines of hardship on his brow spoke of a life tied to this land. This was the master of the house, brought low by some terrible affliction. A glass of water sat just beyond his reach, a silent testament to a last, failed effort. Alara looked at the man, a complete stranger, burning with fever in the dim light. She looked at her suitcase, a symbol of a promise now broken in the most unexpected way. The plan was gone, shattered. But in its place was a person, a life hanging by a thread. In that moment, a new purpose, stark and undeniable, took root in the barren soil of her disappointment. She set her suitcase down on the floor with a soft, definitive thud. She took off her hat and gloves, placing them neatly on the table. She walked to the bed, her shadow falling over him. Her journey had not ended here. It had just begun. The first day bled into the first night, a long, seamless passage of quiet, urgent work. Alara moved with a focused grace, her exhaustion held at bay by a current of sheer will. She found a pail and drew fresh, cold water from the well, the rope stiff and unfamiliar in her hands. The cool, clear water was a small miracle. She returned to the cabin, a sanctuary she was now claiming from the clutches of decay. She bathed the stranger's face, her touch gentle but firm on his feverish skin. He mumbled, his words incoherent fragments of dreams or memories, but he did not resist. She found a small stash of potatoes and onions in a root cellar and set a thin broth to simmer over a fire she coaxed to life in the hearth. The smell of wood smoke and simmering vegetables began to chase the scent of sickness from the room. Sunlight became her ally. Each morning, she threw open the door and the single window, forcing the stale air out and letting the clean, dry light pour in. She scrubbed the floors until the pail would shone. She washed the grimy window pane, and the world outside, the vast, empty plains, seemed less a threat and more a silent witness. She discovered the man's name was Silas from a worn leather-bound Bible on the nightstand, his name inscribed on the front page in a strong, steady hand. Silas Croft. The irony was a bitter pill she swallowed without expression. She was in the right place with the right man, but under the worst possible circumstances. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by his needs and the needs of the homestead. She forced broth between his cracked lips. She changed the damp bedding. She found a festering wound on his leg, the result of what must have been a nasty fall. Cleaning and dressing it became a solemn ritual. She tore strips from her own petticoat for bandages, a sacrifice she made without a second thought. In his brief moments of lucidity, his eyes, a startlingly clear gray, would follow her movements. They held a confusion, a question he was too weak to voice. She would meet his gaze directly, her expression calm and unreadable. "Eat," she would say, her voice low and even, and he would obey. One afternoon, while she was replacing the cool compress on his forehead, his hand twitched, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her. It was the first human touch she had felt in weeks, and it was a fragile anchor in the sea of her uncertainty. Outside, she turned her attention to the neglected garden plot. The earth was cracked and dry, but beneath the stubborn weeds, she saw the promise of life. She pulled the weeds with a vengeance, her hands becoming chapped and raw. She drew bucket after bucket of water, coaxing moisture back into the thirsty soil. She found a small tin of seeds in a drawer: beans, squash, corn. With a broken trowel, she planted them in neat, hopeful rows. The garden became a mirror of her efforts inside the cabin, a tangible symbol of her fight against the encroaching wilderness, against death itself. She talked to the seedlings as they pushed through the soil, her voice a soft murmur. "There now. Grow strong." Weeks passed. The stranger, Silas, slowly began to mend. The fever receded, leaving him gaunt and weak but clear-eyed. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the silence of sickness and uncertainty, but a shared, contemplative quiet. He would watch her for long stretches, his gaze filled with a dawning awe. He saw the way she mended his worn shirt, her stitches small and even. He saw the new cleanness of the cabin, the way the light now filled it. He heard her humming softly as she worked in the garden. She was a ghost of a life he had almost lost. One evening, as she brought him a bowl of thicker stew, he spoke, his voice raspy but clear. "Thank you." Alara paused, her back to him. She did not turn around for a long moment. She simply nodded, the gesture small but freighted with the weight of all the days and nights she had toiled alone. "You were sick," she stated simply, as if that explained everything. Later that week, he tried to sit up on his own. The effort left him dizzy, and he swayed, nearly toppling from the bed. She was there in an instant, her hands on his shoulders, steadying him. He was thin, but his frame was solid, strong. For a moment they were frozen, her small hands on his broad shoulders, his breath catching in his throat. A faint blush rose on her cheeks. He managed a weak, lopsided smile, a flicker of humor in his tired eyes. "Seems my legs forgot their purpose," he rasped. A small smile touched her own lips in return. "They will remember." The day the fever broke for good, the world seemed to hold a different light. It was softer, kinder. Silas sat propped against the pillows, his color returned, the gauntness in his cheeks lessening with each passing day. He watched Alara as she moved through the cabin, her presence now as integral to the small space as the hearth or the table. She had transformed it. Where there had been dust and despair, there was now order and a quiet, persistent hope. The air smelled of baked bread and drying herbs. Through the clean window, the garden was a riot of determined green, a testament to her unwavering care. He followed her with his eyes, a profound sense of wonder settling over him. This woman, a stranger, had walked into the shadow of his death and single-handedly pulled him back into the light. He owed her his life, a debt so immense he did not know how to begin to acknowledge it. Finally, he found his voice, stronger now than it had been in a month. "What is your name?" She was kneading dough on the floured tabletop, her back to him. She stopped, her hands sinking into the soft mass. "Alara," she said, without turning. "Alara," he repeated, testing the sound of it in the quiet room. "Why are you here, Alara?" She wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face him fully. Her expression was direct, her gaze unwavering. She walked over to the small trunk that served as a side table and picked up the letter, its creases as familiar as the lines on her own hand. "I answered an advertisement," she began, her voice even, betraying no emotion. "A man needed a wife, a rancher. He offered a home, a new life. His name was Silas Croft." She held the letter out, not for him to take, but as evidence. "I arrived a month ago. The town said this was his land. I came here, and the house, it was empty. Except for you." She looked at him, her eyes searching his, a flicker of the old uncertainty returning. "I assumed Mr. Croft had moved on. I assumed you were a traveler, someone who had fallen ill seeking shelter here." The silence in the cabin became heavy, thick with unspoken truths. Silas stared at her, at the earnest set of her jaw, the strength in her tired eyes. He saw the whole story laid bare. Her hopeful arrival, her crushing disappointment, her selfless decision to stay and care for a dying stranger she believed was standing in the way of her future. A wave of shame and overwhelming gratitude washed over him. He pushed himself up higher, his muscles protesting. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with emotion. "My leg. I was mending a fence line on the north pasture. A rock slide. My horse was killed. It took me 2 days to crawl back here." He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "The fever came on fast. I don't remember much after that." He took a deep, shaky breath, the confession sitting heavy on his tongue. "Alara, I am Silas Croft." Alara's breath caught. She stared at him, her mind refusing to connect the man in the bed, the vulnerable patient she had nursed and tended, whose life had been in her hands, with the name on the letter, the faceless rancher who had promised her a future. She looked from his face to the letter, then back again. The neglected ranch, the illness, her solitary vigil, it all clicked into a new, staggering alignment. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been fighting for his life alone until she arrived. Just then, a horse trotted into the yard. A moment later, a knock came at the door. It was the town doctor, a portly, worried-looking man. "Heard from a passing hunter that Croft was in a bad way. Came as soon as I could." The doctor bustled in, stopping short at the sight of Silas, awake and alert, and the clean, orderly cabin. He examined his patient with a practiced eye, clucking his tongue in astonishment. Pneumonia and a badly infected leg. Son, you are lucky to be alive. Another few days. He trailed off, looking from Silas to Alara, who stood quietly by the hearth. He looked at her chapped, clean hands, at the determined line of her mouth, and understanding dawned on his face. Or perhaps, the doctor amended, his voice full of a new respect. You are lucky she was here sometime later, after the doctor had departed, leaving tinctures and instructions. A comfortable quiet settled once more. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose. Silas was now strong enough to sit in a chair by the open door, a blanket over his legs. Alara worked in the garden, her movements fluid and familiar. He watched her pluck a weed, her fingers gentle around the stem of a flourishing tomato plant. She had not only saved him, she had saved his home, breathing life back into the very soil. He finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear in the evening air. You brought my home back to life. Alara straightened up, pushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead. She looked at the thriving garden, at the clean cabin, and then her gaze settled on him, truly seeing him not as a patient or a stranger, but as the man who was her future. We did, she said softly. He reached out, not to her, but toward the plant she had just tended. His fingers, still thin but regaining their strength, brushed against hers as they rested on a green leaf. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it was charged with everything that had passed between them. Sickness and health, despair and hope, silence and understanding. They held each other's gaze as the golden light enveloped them, their promised life as strangers annulled, replaced by the silent, unshakable foundation of a partnership already forged in the deepest fires of hardship and grace.